Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight we're stepping into medieval Europe, not into the castles and banquet halls of kings and queens, but into the muddy lanes, small chapels, and wooden cottages where most people lived and loved. Weddings in the Middle Ages weren't fairy tales with silk gowns and golden crowns. For the majority of peasants, they were practical unions, tangled knots of love, duty, family pressure, and sheer survival. In a world where life was short, harsh, and uncertain, marriage wasn't simply a matter of romance. It was an economic partnership, a pooling of resources that could mean the difference between enduring a hard winter or starving in it. Two families might negotiate for weeks, weighing dowries, livestock, or land rights before the bride and groom even spoke a word. A young woman's worth might be measured in the number of chickens, goats, or plots of farmland her family could provide, while a young man was judged on his ability to labor, defend, and produce heirs. Yet despite the bargaining and bartering, weddings were also moments of joy and release for villages where daily life meant endless toil. The ceremony itself could be simple: a blessing at the church door, vows exchanged in the presence of neighbors, and the sharing of bread and ale to seal the union. But once the vows were spoken, the real celebration began. Barrels were rolled out, music filled the air, and the village danced and feasted, sometimes for days. Clothing was humble but symbolic. Brides often wore their best wool dress, sometimes dyed in brighter colors if the family could afford it, while grooms appeared in their sturdiest tunic and hose. Flowers, herbs, and garlands added touches of beauty and meaning, believed to bring luck, fertility, and protection against evil spirits. And then there was the bedding ceremony, a tradition both awkward and binding. The newlyweds were led to their bed by friends and family, cheered on as they lay down together. Privacy was a luxury most peasants couldn't afford, and in some regions consummation was witnessed, or at least loudly encouraged, by the community. It was both spectacle and seal, proof that the marriage was not just words, but flesh and future. For peasants, weddings were not glamorous, but they were profound. They marked the forging of alliances, the hope of children, and the promise that two lives, however difficult, would now be endured together. In a world of famine, war, and disease, that promise meant everything. While peasants married for survival, nobles and royals married for power. In medieval Europe, the wedding of a lord, princess, or king was rarely about love. It was about alliances, dynasties, and influence. A single union could shift the balance of kingdoms, secure borders, or ignite wars that would last generations. From the moment a child of noble blood was born, their marital fate was already being considered. Daughters became bargaining chips in international diplomacy. Their hands promised years before they reached maturity. Sons, too, were pawns. Their unions meant to extend landholdings, forge military bonds, or merge noble houses into greater forces of wealth and authority. To refuse such a marriage was unthinkable. To accept it was a duty to family and country. The weddings themselves were spectacles designed to dazzle. Cathedrals rang with the sound of choirs, priests intoned Latin blessings, and the bride and groom, often still teenagers, stood stiffly in garments woven with gold thread, embroidered silks, and ermine-lined cloaks. Jewelry gleamed not only as decoration, but as symbols of wealth and legitimacy, while crowns and circlets reminded everyone of the bloodlines being joined. But the vows were only part of the show. The feasts that followed were acts of political theater in themselves. Banquet halls groaned under the weight of roasted boars, swans, and peacocks served with their feathers reattached for display. Musicians, jesters, and acrobats performed as nobles toasted, bargained, and whispered in the corners, turning the wedding into a diplomatic summit, disguised as a celebration. Marriage also carried legal weight. Contracts were signed, lands exchanged, dowries recorded in ink to prevent disputes that might ripple for decades. A noblewoman might bring with her a chest of silver, acres of fertile land, or even entire towns as part of her dowry, binding her husband's loyalty to her family. In return, she was expected to provide heirs, preferably sons, to secure the future of the dynasty. Love, if it came at all, was a fortunate accident. Many noble couples lived lives of formality, their duties overshadowing affection. Yet some defied expectation, forging bonds that outlasted the political motives of their union. Others found love outside the marriage bed, sparking scandals, rivalries, and sometimes bloodshed. For the nobility, a wedding was far more than a union between two people. It was the weaving of kingdoms, the sealing of treaties, and the staging of power in its grandest form. Where peasants celebrated survival, nobles celebrated dominance. If peasant weddings were about survival and noble weddings about power, then the layer that bound them all together was superstition. In the medieval world, no marriage was considered safe without rituals, charms, and traditions meant to guard the couple from misfortune, envy, or even demons. Every stage of the wedding process was laced with belief. The choice of the wedding day, for instance, was rarely random. Certain days of the week were thought lucky. Wednesday was best, while Friday, associated with Christ's crucifixion, was avoided. The phase of the moon also mattered. A waxing moon promised growth and prosperity, while a waning one hinted at decline. Clothing too carried meaning. Brides often wore blue, the color of purity, before white gowns became fashionable much later. Flowers weren't just pretty, they were protective. Garlic, dill, or rosemary might be woven into garlands to ward off evil spirits. Even the bouquet's fragrance was thought to shield the bride from sickness or curses. One of the strangest customs was the bedding ceremony. After the feast, friends and relatives sometimes escorted the newlyweds to their bedchamber with raucous laughter, music, and bawdy jokes. In some places, guests stayed to witness or at least symbolically confirm the consummation of the marriage, an uncomfortable reminder that marriage was not just personal, but also communal and legal. Food and drink also played their part. Sharing a sweet cake or honeyed wine was more than festivity. It was a magical act, a way of ensuring fertility and sweetness in married life. In fact, the term honeymoon comes from the old tradition of drinking mead, a honey-based wine, for a month after the wedding, believed to enhance fertility and marital harmony. Even seemingly small details held weight. Iron was tucked under beds to repel evil, bells were rung to chase away spirits, and certain charms were given to brides as protection from infertility. A sneeze during the ceremony was considered a blessing, but stumbling was a dire omen. Looking back, many of these practices seem strange or even comical, but to medieval people they were serious matters of fate. In a world where life was uncertain, where disease, famine, and war loomed over daily existence, superstition offered reassurance. Weddings were not only about joining two people, they were about aligning with forces beyond human control. No medieval wedding was complete without a feast, and depending on one's status, these could range from modest gatherings in a smoky cottage to days-long banquets inside drafty castles. But no matter how rich or poor, celebration was essential, because marriage was not only a union of two people, but a public declaration of life, continuity, and community. For peasants, the feast often meant everyone in the village bringing what they could: bread, cheese, ale, and maybe a roasted pig if fortune smiled. The tables were simple, sometimes just planks set on barrels, but the atmosphere was alive with laughter, music, and the smell of smoke and sweat. Dancing in muddy courtyards went on until exhaustion, fueled by cheap ale and the sheer relief of having something joyful to celebrate. For nobles, however, the wedding feast was theater. Great halls were decorated with banners, tapestries, and flowers. Guests reclined at long trestle tables while servants carried in courses of food that seemed to never end. Roasted swans gilded with gold leaf, peacocks with feathers reattached for display, venison, boar, exotic spices from the east, and enormous pies filled with live birds that burst out when cut open, a spectacle designed to impress. Mead and wine flowed freely, often leading to drunken chaos before the night was done. Music was everywhere. Minstrels plucked lutes, blew horns, or beat drums, while jongleurs performed tricks or bawdy songs that had the guests roaring. Dancing ranged from dignified processions for nobles to wild, stomping jigs among peasants. In both cases, the purpose was the same: to bind the community together in shared joy. Of course, with so much food and alcohol, things could get rowdy. Fights broke out, chairs were overturned, and sometimes the celebrations spilled into the streets, turning into days-long festivals where even strangers joined in. Weddings were one of the few moments when life's harshness could be forgotten, if only for a while in a haze of music, laughter, and overflowing cups. But beyond the chaos and indulgence, the feast carried meaning. To eat and drink together was to affirm bonds, to show wealth and generosity, and to promise abundance for the future of the couple. In a world where hunger was common and survival uncertain, a wedding feast was more than celebration. It was a defiant statement of life's persistence. While the feasts and dances gave weddings their noise and color, it was the church that gave them legitimacy. In medieval Europe, marriage was not simply a personal contract between two people or families. It was a sacred bond overseen by God and sanctified by ritual. Without the blessing of the church, a union was considered incomplete, sometimes even sinful. By the 12th century, the church had firmly established marriage as one of the 7 sacraments. This meant that weddings were no longer just family matters. They were spiritual obligations, tied to salvation itself. Priests officiated the vows, holy water was sprinkled, and the couple was blessed before the altar, often in front of the entire parish. The community was expected to bear witness, ensuring not only transparency but also accountability. Consent was central, at least in theory. Both bride and groom had to declare their willingness aloud. "I do," though in practice, family pressure or political necessity often outweighed personal choice. Still, the church insisted that marriage required the free consent of both parties, a stance that would echo through centuries of legal tradition. Certain rules were rigid. Marriages could not take place during Lent or Advent, times of religious fasting. Blood relatives, even distant ones, were forbidden to marry unless a special dispensation was granted. Secret marriages conducted without public witnesses or priestly blessing were condemned and could lead to scandal or annulment. The church also wove symbolism into the ceremony. The joining of hands was more than a gesture. It represented binding before God. The exchange of rings, often plain bands of metal, signified eternity and fidelity. Prayers invoked saints to protect the union, while the final blessing of the bedchamber emphasized that the marriage was incomplete until consummated. Beyond ritual, the church acted as arbiter. Disputes over dowries, legitimacy of heirs, or accusations of adultery were often brought before ecclesiastical courts. Priests could annul marriages under specific conditions, while bishops might intervene in high-profile cases involving nobles and royalty. In many ways, the church's control over marriage was both spiritual and political. By sanctifying unions, it reinforced its role as moral authority in daily life. At the same time, by regulating who could marry whom, it extended influence over inheritance, alliances, and power structures. For the medieval mind, this intertwining of love, law, and faith was natural. To marry was not just to promise loyalty to a partner, it was to promise loyalty to God, with the church standing as guardian of that vow. If the church sanctified marriage, kings and nobles weaponized it. In medieval Europe, the union of royalty or great aristocratic houses was rarely about love. It was about land, titles, and power. A single wedding could redraw borders, secure peace between warring kingdoms, or ignite new conflicts if alliances soured. Royal weddings were spectacles on a scale that ordinary people could hardly imagine. Picture great halls hung with silks, altars gleaming with gold, and tables groaning under the weight of exotic foods brought from distant lands. Diplomats, knights, bishops, and ambassadors from across Europe crowded in to witness the ceremony, each aware that what they saw was not just a marriage, but the forging of history. Every detail was drenched in symbolism. The bride's garments, often embroidered with jewels and precious metals, were less clothing and more a walking display of wealth and dynastic prestige. The dowry she carried, sometimes entire provinces, fleets of ships, or chests of silver, was a declaration of her family's power. The groom, usually a prince or king, pledged not just to his bride, but to her lineage, her allies, and the lands she represented. Take the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II of England in 1152. This was not merely a personal union. It created one of the most powerful empires of the Middle Ages, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Or consider the betrothal of Catherine of Aragon to Prince Arthur of England, later to Henry VIII. It bound together the crowns of England and Spain, shaping centuries of politics. The ceremonies themselves were elaborate, often lasting for days. Tournaments, jousts, and feasts followed, where knights tilted in honor of the new bride and poets sang verses extolling the virtues of the union. Gifts were exchanged not only between families but between entire nations. Horses, rare textiles, spices, and even castles could change hands as part of the wedding contract. Yet beneath the glitter lay immense pressure. Brides were often teenagers, married off before they even reached womanhood, while grooms carried the weight of dynastic expectations on their shoulders. Love, if it ever came, was a luxury, secondary to the demands of politics. But in the eyes of the world, these royal weddings were binding threads in the fabric of Christendom. They showed that power could be made visible not only on the battlefield, but also in the solemn words of a marriage vow, spoken beneath vaulted ceilings and watched by the eyes of nations. For all their grandeur, medieval marriages, especially among nobles and royals, were not unshakable. They were contracts wrapped in velvet and sealed with prayers, but beneath the surface they could be as fragile as glass. A marriage could bring kingdoms together one day and tear them apart the next if love soured. Alliances shifted or heirs failed to arrive. Annulments were a powerful tool, often used less for matters of conscience than for matters of convenience. The church, as guardian of marriage, could declare a union invalid for reasons like consanguinity, being too closely related, failure to consummate, or lack of proper consent. In practice, these reasons were sometimes stretched to accommodate the ambitions of kings and nobles. Consider King Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their union began with promise but collapsed in bitterness. Officially annulled on grounds of consanguinity, it was no secret that Eleanor's strong will clashed with Louis's piety. Within weeks, she married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England, instantly transforming the balance of power in Europe and sparking centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. Tragedy also haunted many unions. Childbirth, one of the greatest duties expected of medieval brides, was fraught with danger. Queens and noblewomen often died young, sometimes leaving dynasties without heirs and kingdoms on the brink of civil war. The death of a bride could unravel treaties, plunge courts into mourning, and force hurried remarriages to secure succession. Even when both bride and groom survived, suspicion could corrode the bond. Whispers of adultery, infertility, or betrayal could poison a union. Courts were hotbeds of intrigue, where rivals waited eagerly for cracks to appear in royal marriages, ready to exploit them for political gain. A single scandal could bring down reputations, topple alliances, and even lead to bloody conflicts. For the common people watching from outside, these dramas must have seemed both distant and strangely familiar. While peasants did not marry for kingdoms, they too knew the fragility of unions threatened by death, poverty, or betrayal. The difference was that when royal marriages failed, the consequences could ripple across continents. In the end, medieval marriage, no matter how lavish or humble, was always a gamble. It was a promise made before God, but also a chess move in the game of life and power. And just as often as it secured peace and prosperity, it left behind heartbreak, feuds, and the ashes of broken vows. The feasts ended, the music faded, and the last torches burned low. But once the ceremony was over and the guests dispersed, the true test of marriage began. Not in the church or the hall, but in the quiet of daily life. For medieval couples, whether peasants in a thatched hut or nobles in a stone castle, marriage was not a fairy tale ending. It was the start of a partnership shaped by duty, survival, and occasionally affection. For peasants, married life was rooted in labor. A husband and wife worked side by side from dawn to dusk. Fields had to be plowed, livestock tended, bread baked, wool spun. Children soon joined the household, not as burdens but as extra hands in the struggle for survival. Privacy was scarce, and tenderness, while it surely existed, was often overshadowed by necessity. Love was expressed less in poetry than in the sharing of toil, splitting firewood, kneading dough, or carrying water together. In noble households, marriage life was more complex but no less demanding. A noblewoman was expected to manage the estate in her husband's absence, overseeing servants, collecting rents, and ensuring that the manor ran smoothly. Her duties extended beyond the domestic sphere. She was also responsible for securing alliances through hospitality and maintaining the honor of her husband's name. For noblemen, hunting, Warfare and governance filled their days, leaving little time for intimacy. Yet letters from the period reveal moments of genuine longing, suggesting that even arranged marriages could grow into bonds of respect and affection. Of course, not all was harmonious. Tensions over money, inheritance, and fidelity could strain even the strongest of unions. Women particularly bore the weight of expectation. A wife's honor was tied to chastity and obedience, and failure to produce heirs could bring shame or annulment. In peasant homes, disputes might end with harsh words or public scorn. In noble courts, they could escalate into scandals whispered through Europe. Still, within these marriages lay resilience. Couples carved out moments of intimacy amid the demands of duty, sharing meals by the hearth, exchanging gifts, or praying together in chapels. Festivals and holy days offered brief reprieves when husbands and wives could celebrate side by side. And for all the hardships, many medieval couples endured, raised children, and found comfort in companionship that, though not always romantic in the modern sense, was deeply rooted in partnership. Marriage, in the medieval world, was rarely about bliss. It was about survival, honor, and duty, but also about finding, in another person, the strength to endure the weight of life. When we step back and look at medieval weddings in all their forms, from the muddy village gatherings to the jewel-studded spectacles of kings, we see more than rituals, feasts, or contracts. We see humanity itself, grappling with the timeless challenge of binding lives together in a world filled with uncertainty. For peasants, marriage was survival. It meant two sets of hands to work the land, to share hunger and harvest, to endure cold nights under a leaky roof. For nobles, it was strategy and legacy, alliances written not only in ink but in blood, shaping dynasties and borders. And for all, whether humble or exalted, it was a passage into a life of duty, expectation, and hope. What is striking is how universal the desire was to mark this transition with meaning. Superstitions, sacred blessings, lavish feasts, and solemn vows, each layer was a way of saying, "This moment matters." Life in the Middle Ages was fragile. Death lurked in childbirth, famine, and war. To marry was to defy that fragility with a promise to declare before God and community that life would continue. And yet beneath the weight of obligation, there were sparks of humanity that feel achingly familiar. A nervous bride adjusting her garland of flowers, a young husband sneaking a smile during the vows, a couple sharing bread and laughter after the guests were gone. These moments remind us that even in a world so different from ours, people longed for the same things we do: connection, belonging, and the hope of building a future together. Medieval weddings were not fairy tales. They were complex, often harsh, sometimes joyous, sometimes tragic, but they were profoundly human. And in their stories of survival, power, faith, and love, we catch a glimpse of ourselves across the centuries, bound by the same desire to turn the chaos of life into something lasting, something sacred, something shared.